The largest island of the Western Hemisphere, the gem of the Caribbean Sea, the land of never-ending summer, exotica and the legendary communist revolution. Today they rarely talk about it and try to hide the poverty of once the richest country of Latin America by passing off underdevelopment as the authentic rarity of the past. However, a couple of years ago, Havana was the place that could have started the Third World Atomic War. The world would never be as it was before Fidel Alejandro Castro rose.
When the philosophy of plunder disappears, so will the philosophy of war. We, Cuban revolutionaries, understand our international duty to all the oppressed people of the world. We face a common enemy. That's why we state that whatever you are on this planet, you can count on the support of the Cuban fighter.
These Comandante's words have made into the Guinness Book. His 1960 speech in the United Nations Hall lasted 4.5 hours. The position of Cuban leader seemed quite straightforward after those words. Washington is the main threat to the planet, and Comandante is going to protect the world against it with a new ally. Before leaving the main hall of the UN, he was enthusiastically shaking hands with Nikita Khrushchev. The black line of failures was finally over. The union with the Bolshevist Moscow promised great perspectives. Fidel was not wrong. For a long time, the Kremlin has been dreaming of strengthening its positions overseas. Soon enough, he was given not only money to fund his anti-American activities, but also a chance to have some fun. In 1963, he was invited to USSR. Khrushchev took him on winter hunting and fishing. And of course, legendary Jansak drinking parties that were interrupted only to take Commandante's legend. To make him drag the sled with Russian communists and to get into power play while still tipsy. And then they had to return to the table because communists cannot solve the problems of the oppressed working class when sober. Castro was born in a wealthy farmer's family. His father, as the majority of Cuban middle class, earned money growing sugarcane. It were Jesuits who put rebellious ideas in the boy's head.
When Fidel finished school, in his characteristics I wrote that this boy has the whole range of traits needed to become a great person in the future.
In Havana University, he joined rebellious student leftist organizations. His wild character urged him to action. Unfortunately, every Fidel's endeavor ended up in difficulties and failures. He was expelled from the university. The dream to go to Harvard was lost when he failed the admission exam. Back then, he gave Americans a special place in the list of his enemies. More importantly, the Yankees were the main investors in Cuba, so they held privileged position on the island of freedom.
Some men of the oligarchy think
We ask ourselves, why there is a monopoly of the United States interest on our land? Why do we have to pay Americans' bills? We want to change the social situation that confines our people, while the others roll up money on their expense.
Castro joined the socialist group of conspirators who wanted to start a coup in Dominican Republic and miraculously survived when the insurgents were crushed. At home, he becomes a member of an opposition party and searches for fame by criticizing the government. At the end of 1940s, Fulgencio Batista served his third term as a president. Corruption scandals flooded the country. However, the life of the island of freedom seemed rather untroubled. Cuba has the third highest GDP per capita after USA and Canada. Casino and beaches were the places where Americans left millions of dollars. Cuba was called Luxembourg of Latin America. While continuing his political career, Fidel gets married. His wife is not an ordinary girl. Mirta Diaz-Balart y Gutierrez was the daughter of Banas city mayor, who was the old friend of Batista. The newlyweds received a gift of $1,000 from the president, and it allows them to spend the honeymoon in New York. Afterwards, Castro's action became even firmer. He takes up arms to start a national revolution. But he fails. In 1953, he and his comrades attack Moncada barracks.
We wanted to generate a spark that will start a national uprising against Batista regime.
The attack failed, while Castro miraculously survived and went to prison.
He was very emotional during the hearing and said, "You may kill me because I regret nothing. Let the history judge me." He hit his fist against the table and spoke calmly, "That's it, I've finished."
There he is allowed to write letters. From his camera, Fidel keeps cold business-like correspondence with his wife and sends passionate letters to his lover, a party comrade. For an attempted coup, Castro was sentenced to 15 years of prison, but he spent there less than 2. Dictator Batista was so cruel that granted Fidel amnesty and released him. The wife, who was fighting for their marriage despite the pro-presidential position of her family, has found out about his affair and left her failed revolutionary. Fidel went into exile to Mexico.
The only thing he wanted was power. His anti-American rhetoric was just a way to gain more popularity.
In Mexico, Castro devised a new plan for the seizure of power. On Cuba, President Batista started violently turning the screws to stay in power and uphold American interests.
We considered him our guy. He knew that he could stay in power only with our support.
On the night of November 25, 1956, nearly 100 of people packed their weapons and rounds into the hold of yacht Granma and sailed back home. In 5 days, they had to reach their destination and back up the uprising, but Fidel was crushed again. Because of the storm, he was a day late. Guerrilla squads were destroyed and the fighters were met by the state troops on the beach. Only 20 people out of 80 Comandante's companions managed to survive. The group of revenant communists ran away to the mountains. The chance for a successful coup was lost again, and with a cigar in his mouth, Fidel was considering to shoot himself after counting all the failures he had to endure.
Some things appear to be far more difficult than we imagined.
Damned Americans were the ones to give him hope. The New York Times journalist Herbert Matthews came to Sierra Maestra Mountains to make the series of reportages about the guerrilla fighters who were called terrorists in Havana. Police let him in because he was an American. However, Matthews was not an average Yankee. He was sympathetic to left wing. His articles on Spanish Civil War concealed the communist crimes and presented the conflict as defied between idealism and fascism. He did the same thing in Cuba. The New York Times made a hero out of loser and terrorist, a romantic revolutionary who fought the corruption and exploitation of his people.
Batista can be compared to the similar criminal, Hitler. We fight for democracy and against tyranny. Our ideas are not about communism or Marxism. We fight for social justice and well-planned economy.
The New York Times was showing a young lawyer who left the practice to change his tie to military boots. The only thing left on his previous life was a cigar. He threw all of him and his family on the altar of revolution. The image of Saint Patriot played right into the partisans' hands. For Castro, it was the first success in the long line of failures. White House did not expect that the Cuban Revolution will be successful. At the same time, the American society grew tired from all the complaints on Batista, so Washington gradually left him one-on-one with the Civil War. It was probably the biggest mistake Americans made.
If we knew that Castro was a communist, he would help Batista's government put down the rebellion at any cost.
The parade in Havana was the biggest triumph for Castro. Cuba's capital was taken by the revolutionaries on January 1st, 1959. They were welcomed as the liberators. President Batista ran away to the US, and Comandante started his rule with radical changes. Revolutionaries rapidly showed what the real terror is. Revolutionary courts didn't waste a lot of time with the cases involving those who were suspected to support Batista's government. Even minors could accuse someone. Thousands of Cubans go to prison and hundreds of names are included in the hit lists.
Castro's regime started closing the churches, banishing priests. It was practically a hunt for everyone who could be accused of disloyalty to the new government. My father was tortured in prison for a few days. Our family farms were taken away, even though we worked there all our lives.
Castro's father was included in the list of farmers from whom the agrarian reform, expropriation of land shares, started. Reprivatization of American companies was conducted on a mass meeting where Fidel lost his voice.
We got really worried then, so his brother Raul replaced him in front of the microphone.
He continued his speech and informed that all the property of big American companies is subject to reprivatization.
Castro continued adding names of companies to his list. American citizens and supporters of the old regime hurried to move to the USA. Uncle Sam could not silently swallow this insolent infringement on his business. The US refused to buy Cuban sugar and introduced some sanctions. Fidel even had to fly to Washington and negotiate the matter.
No, we haven't come here to seek financial aid. We just want to understood. I want to explain our position and for what we are fighting. We are a poor country rich in resources, so we want to collaborate with your rich country.
Vice President Nixon warned him that the change of policy is possible if Cuba finally leaves the communist orbit. Castro flew back to Havana and returned to the USA in a year. In New York in 1960, during the General Assembly of the UN, he met Khrushchev and openly joined the Bolshevist bloc in Cold War. CIA received an order to get rid of Comandante. However, that's a whole other story.